She stood in the back row of a wedding that was never supposed to happen, holding a folder that could destroy 2 lives in the same breath, and she had exactly 4 minutes left to decide if she was brave enough to use it. Somewhere in that room sat a bride in white who had no idea her husband-to-be already had a wife. Somewhere in that room sat a mother who had raised her son better than this. And somewhere in that room, a woman named Danielle Carter waited for the one sentence in the entire ceremony that would give her permission to speak. What happened next would be talked about in that family for the rest of their lives, and by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Danielle Carter was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, the oldest of 3 sisters raised almost entirely by their mother, a woman who worked double shifts at a downtown hospital just to keep food on the table and the lights on. From an early age, Danielle understood that nothing good in life arrived without effort, and she carried that belief into every corner of her adult years, including the way she loved. She was practical, steady, and fiercely loyal, the kind of woman who showed up early and stayed late, who remembered birthdays and kept promises, who believed that love at its core was less about grand gestures and more about consistency over time. She met Marcus Freeman at a mutual friend's backyard cookout 15 years earlier, on a warm Saturday afternoon filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue drifting across the yard. Marcus had a calm confidence about him that immediately reminded Danielle of her own father, a quiet ambition that never needed to announce itself in the room. He made her laugh within the first 10 minutes of conversation, and by the end of that evening, both of them already suspected they had found something worth pursuing. They dated for 2 years before Marcus proposed on a quiet evening at her mother's kitchen table. No elaborate scheme, no crowd of onlookers, just the 2 of them and a small velvet box that Danielle would later say felt more honest than anything else he had ever given her. Their wedding took place in the garden behind Danielle's childhood home, string lights strung between the trees by her sisters, folding chairs borrowed from the church down the street, and a small 3-piece band that played until well past midnight. It was not an extravagant celebration, but it was a deeply happy one, filled with the kind of joy that doesn't need decoration to be remembered. Danielle's mother cried through both the vows and the first dance, and her sister Renee gave a toast that had the entire yard laughing and wiping their eyes at the same time. For years afterward, that single afternoon remained one of the happiest memories either of them carried, a snapshot of a beginning neither of them could have imagined would end the way it eventually did. The years that followed were, by most outward measures, good ones. Marcus built a steady career as a logistics consultant, a job that occasionally required travel but mostly kept him close to home, and Danielle worked her way up at a regional insurance firm, eventually managing a small team of her own. They bought a modest brick house on a quiet street lined with oak trees, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors waved from their porches and children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. They grieved together through a difficult miscarriage in their 2nd year of marriage, a loss that could have easily split a weaker couple apart, but instead, for a long time, seemed to draw them closer. To anyone watching from the outside, their marriage looked like exactly the kind of steady, dependable love most people spend their whole lives hoping to find. It was around the 14-month mark, before this story reaches its turning point, that something in Marcus began, almost imperceptibly, to change. He started staying later at the office, first by an hour, then 2, then sometimes not arriving home until well after Danielle had already gone to bed. He began taking phone calls behind closed doors, a habit he had never had before, lowering his voice whenever Danielle happened to walk past. He came home one evening wearing a cologne she had never bought him and did not recognize, a small detail that on its own meant nothing, but combined with everything else, settled into her chest like a stone she couldn't quite name. None of these things alone were enough to raise an alarm. Together, they built a slow, quiet unease that Danielle carried with her through the following weeks, unsure whether she was imagining trouble or finally noticing something that had been there all along. She told herself more than once that 15 years of marriage had earned her husband the benefit of the doubt. She reminded herself of every anniversary they had celebrated, every late night spent talking through problems at the kitchen table, every small kindness that had built the foundation of their life together. Trust, she believed, was not something you abandoned at the first sign of discomfort. And so for weeks, she said nothing, watched quietly, and told herself that whatever was shifting between them was simply the natural strain of 2 people juggling careers, a mortgage, and the slow accumulation of years. She did not yet know how wrong that reassurance would turn out to be, or how close she already was to the truth without realizing it. The moment everything changed arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the mail brought their monthly credit card statement, a task Danielle had handled without complaint for the entire length of their marriage, a habit inherited from watching her own mother manage every dollar with careful precision. She sat at the kitchen table scanning through the usual charges, groceries, gas, a streaming subscription, until her eyes landed on a single line that did not belong. A deposit just over $4,000, paid to a venue she had never heard of, for an event neither of them had ever discussed. She stared at the number for a long moment, telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation, a work function, a favor for a friend, anything other than what the small, cold voice in the back of her mind was already beginning to suspect. She typed the venue's name into a search engine that same evening while Marcus showered upstairs, and the results loaded almost instantly. It was a wedding and event space, elegant, well-reviewed, booked well in advance for exactly the kind of ceremony Danielle herself had once dreamed of as a young bride. Her hands went still on the keyboard. $4,000 was not the kind of money anyone spent covering a work event or helping out a friend. It was a deposit, the first payment toward something much larger, something permanent. She closed the laptop before Marcus came down the stairs and sat in the quiet of their living room turning the number over in her mind, unable yet to say the full shape of what she feared out loud, even to herself. She didn't confront him that night, nor the night after. Instead, several days later, she drove to her sister Renee's apartment in Decatur, sitting at the small kitchen table where the two of them had shared countless conversations over the years, and finally said the words out loud for the first time. She told Renee about the late nights, the closed doors, the unfamiliar cologne, and finally the credit card statement. Renee listened without interrupting, the particular kind of listening sisters reserve for moments they already sense are heavier than they first appear. When Danielle finally admitted her deepest fear, that Marcus might be planning to marry someone else while still legally married to her, Renee did not laugh the suggestion away the way Danielle had almost hoped she would. Instead, her sister grew very quiet, and told her plainly that the only way to know anything for certain was to find someone whose entire job was uncovering exactly this kind of secret. That someone turned out to be a retired detective named Gerald Banks, a man who had spent over 20 years working cases across the city, before opening a small private investigation office on the edge of town. His office smelled faintly of old coffee and printer toner, and he listened to Danielle's story with the calm, practiced patience of someone who had heard every version of betrayal there was to hear. He asked careful, specific questions: the venue's name, the timeframe of Marcus's changing behavior, any names or numbers she might have noticed, and by the end of their first meeting, he told her plainly that he could not promise what he would find, only that he would find something, and that she deserved to know the truth either way. He asked for 2 weeks. Danielle agreed, though she had no way of knowing yet just how long those 14 days would feel. Those 2 weeks became, without question, the hardest stretch of Danielle's adult life. She went to work every morning as though nothing had changed, sat through meetings, answered emails, smiled through small talk with coworkers who had no idea what she was carrying. She came home each evening and cooked dinner, set the table, asked Marcus about his day, and listened to his answers with a new, uncomfortable attentiveness she had never needed before. At night, she lay beside him in the dark, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, wondering which version of the man beside her was real, the husband she had spent 15 years building a life with, or a stranger who had somehow been living quietly inside that same familiar face the entire time. She told no one else what she suspected, not even her mother, unwilling to speak it into existence until she had proof strong enough to survive being wrong. When Gerald Banks finally called her back into his office, he wasted no time on preamble. He slid a folder across his desk and told her, gently but directly, to open it herself when she felt ready. Inside were photographs of Marcus sitting across from a woman named Simone Bradley at a downtown restaurant, his hand resting casually on her shoulder, with the same easy intimacy he had once reserved only for Danielle. There was a printed copy of an online wedding registry listing both their names together. There was a save-the-date card, cream cardstock with elegant gold lettering, announcing a wedding at a venue called Magnolia Manor, scheduled just 12 days from that very afternoon. And beneath all of it sat the most damning document of all, a marriage license application filed with the county clerk's office, listing the groom not as Marcus Freeman, but as Marcus Hale, a quiet fabrication designed specifically to keep his two lives from ever crossing paths in any official record. Danielle sat in that small office for a long time without speaking, the folder open in her lap, her mind returning again and again to the garden behind her mother's house 15 years earlier, the string lights, the borrowed folding chairs, the promises spoken in front of everyone they loved. None of it had felt false while she was living it, and that more than anything else was what made this discovery so unbearable, understanding that somewhere along the way, the man she had built an entire life with had decided he could carry two separate futures at once, and that she had simply been the one he chose not to end first. Gerald Banks let her sit with the silence for as long as she needed before speaking again, his voice quiet but firm, careful not to rush a woman whose entire understanding of her own life had just shifted beneath her feet. He explained plainly what all of this meant under the law. Filing a marriage license while still legally married to someone else was not merely a private betrayal between two people. It was a felony, plain and unambiguous, regardless of how carefully Marcus had tried to disguise his intentions behind a false surname. And the woman on the other end of that deception, Simone Bradley, had no idea whatsoever that she was about to become an unknowing victim of it, entering a marriage that carried no legal standing at all, built entirely on a lie she had never agreed to be part of. Danielle left Gerald Banks's office that afternoon with a decision already beginning to take shape in her mind, one she would spend the following 11 days quietly preparing for with a discipline and composure she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. She reached out to an attorney named Patricia Owens, a sharp, steady woman recommended by a co-worker who had once needed her help through a difficult custody dispute. Patricia listened carefully to everything Danielle laid out, reviewed the documents Gerald Banks had provided, and confirmed exactly what Danielle already suspected. This was bigamy in the clearest possible legal sense, and Simone Bradley deserved, at minimum, to learn the truth before she signed anything that would make her unknowingly complicit in a criminal deception. Patricia did not tell Danielle precisely what to do at the wedding itself, only that regardless of her choice, these facts would eventually surface in a courtroom whether she acted or not, and the only real question left was what kind of story she wanted to be the one to tell when that moment came. Danielle thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over during quiet moments at work, during long showers, during the drive home each evening past the same familiar houses on her street. She realized, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't chasing revenge, not in the way she might have expected from herself in this position. She simply refused. After everything, to remain the only person carrying the full weight of what she now knew. She thought of Simone, a woman she had never met, preparing for a wedding day she believed was the happiest of her life, utterly unaware of the truth waiting quietly in the background. Danielle decided, somewhere in those long, sleepless nights, that she would not let that truth stay hidden a single day longer than it already had. She considered, briefly, confronting Marcus privately at their kitchen table, laying the documents out between them and demanding an explanation in the quiet of their own home. But she knew her husband well enough, after 15 years, to understand exactly how that conversation would unfold. Marcus was skilled with words, persuasive by both nature and profession, and given a private room and enough time, he would find some way to soften the truth, to make the conversation smaller, more survivable, more forgivable than it truly was. Danielle decided she would not give him that private room. If the truth was going to come out, it would come out in the one place he could not control, the very room where his lie was about to become permanent in front of everyone who mattered to him. Over the following 11 days, Danielle became someone she hadn't quite been before, precise, unhurried, and calm in a way that surprised even her own sister. She gathered every document she would need, her original marriage certificate, still legally binding after 15 years, a copy of the fraudulent license Marcus had filed under a false name, and Gerald Banks's notarized investigative report, each page a quiet, undeniable piece of a truth Marcus believed no one would ever uncover. She spoke with Patricia Owens twice more during that stretch, confirming every legal detail, making certain nothing she planned to do would jeopardize the case that was almost certainly coming. Throughout it all, Marcus moved through his days as though nothing at all had shifted beneath him, kissing her goodbye each morning with the same easy familiarity he always had, utterly unaware that his wife now knew everything. 11 days after opening that folder in Gerald Banks's office, Danielle woke before sunrise on the morning of the wedding, the house quiet around her, Marcus already gone, having left 2 days earlier for what he described as a work retreat upstate. She stood in front of her closet for a long time before finally choosing a simple charcoal dress, nothing elaborate, nothing meant to draw attention on its own, because she was not dressing for a celebration that morning, she was dressing for a reckoning. She packed the folder carefully into a plain black bag alongside her phone, fully charged, its recording application tested twice the night before to make certain it would work exactly when she needed it to. Renee arrived just after 9 that morning, dressed and ready, her jaw set with the same quiet resolve Danielle had been carrying for nearly 2 weeks. Neither sister said much during the drive out toward Magnolia Manor, the GPS calling out each turn with a cheerful indifference that felt almost cruel given the weight sitting between them. Somewhere along that drive, Danielle's phone buzzed once with a message from Marcus, 4 short words sent from wherever he happened to be getting dressed that morning: love you, see you Sunday. A message written by a man who had no idea his wife already knew precisely where he was and precisely what he was about to do. Danielle read the words twice, then set the phone face down in her lap, and did not reply. Magnolia Manor came into view at the end of a long stone driveway lined with old oak trees, just beginning to turn gold for the season, its white columned entrance catching the early afternoon light, exactly the way its wedding photographs online had promised it would. Valets in crisp black vests waved a steady line of arriving cars toward the entrance, while guests in soft pastel dresses and dark tailored suits made their way up a winding stone path toward the sound of a string quartet warming up somewhere just out of sight. Danielle parked at the far edge of the lot, deliberately out of view from the main entrance, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on her knees, before finally opening the car door and stepping out into air that smelled faintly of cut grass and distant magnolia blossoms. Inside, the ceremony space had been arranged with careful elegance, long rows of white chairs facing a tall arch wrapped in magnolia blossoms, sunlight filtering softly through tall windows onto guests who were only just beginning to settle into their seats. At the front stood Marcus, dressed in a charcoal suit not unlike the color Danielle herself had chosen that morning, smiling with an easy, practiced confidence Danielle remembered clearly from her own wedding 15 years earlier, a smile she had once believed belonged only to her. He had not yet noticed her arrival. Danielle found a seat near the back beside Renee, opened her bag just enough to confirm the folder was still exactly where she had placed it, and settled in to wait for a single sentence buried somewhere inside a ceremony most modern weddings had long since chosen to skip entirely. The music shifted, and every guest rose to their feet as Simone Bradley appeared at the far end of the aisle, radiant in white, entirely unaware of the truth about to unfold around her within minutes. Danielle watched her walk forward with a strange, distant ache settling in her chest, because whatever else was true, Simone was not the villain of this story. She was simply the second person this same lie had been told to, arriving 12 days behind the first without ever knowing it. Marcus watched Simone approach with an expression of open, unguarded happiness Danielle hadn't seen directed toward her in a very long time, and that particular honesty, she realized in that moment, was itself the deepest betrayal of all, because it proved beyond any doubt that none of this had ever been confusion or weakness. It had been a clear and deliberate choice, made with his eyes fully open. The officiant began speaking about commitment, about the weight of promises made in front of witnesses, about the particular kind of trust that marriage asks 2 people to place in each other for the rest of their lives, and Danielle let the words wash quietly past her, counting her own heartbeat in the silence between sentences, waiting for the one line she had spent 11 days preparing herself to answer. Finally, near the end of the opening remarks, the officiant asked, in the old traditional phrasing most modern ceremonies had long since abandoned, whether anyone present had a lawful reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage, and if so, to speak now or forever hold their peace. For a brief moment, the entire room settled into a stillness so complete it felt as though even the string quartet had stopped breathing. Danielle stood. 200 faces turned as one toward the back row, toward a woman in charcoal grey none of them recognized, standing very straight with a folder held firmly in both hands. She said, in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as she had feared it might, that she did in fact have a lawful reason to object, and that her name was Danielle Carter, and that 15 years earlier in a small garden not unlike this very room, she had married the man standing at that altar. Not Marcus Hale, the name listed on the marriage license he had filed with the county just 6 weeks earlier, but Marcus Freeman, her husband, a marriage that had never once at any point been legally dissolved. She raised the folder slightly and explained, clearly and without hurry, that inside it were her original marriage certificate, a copy of his fraudulent license application, and a notarized investigator's report confirming everything she was about to say. Simone's bouquet slipped from her hands and fell soundlessly onto the white runner beneath her feet, the sound somehow louder than anything else in that frozen, silent room. She turned first to Marcus, her voice cracking on a single desperate demand for him to tell her that none of this was true, that there had to be some mistake, some explanation that would make the last few seconds disappear entirely. Marcus said nothing at all, his face drained of color, and in a room filled with 200 witnesses, that silence answered far more clearly than any words ever could have. Simone's mother rushed forward from the front row to steady her daughter, while Marcus's own mother sat frozen in her seat, one hand pressed against her mouth as the full, undeniable weight of her son's actions settled over her in real time. What followed was not a single explosive confrontation, but a slow and painful unraveling that played out in front of every guest gathered in that room, each new question peeling back another layer of a lie that had taken 14 months to build and less than 4 minutes to collapse entirely. Simone demanded to know exactly when Marcus had planned to tell her the truth, whether it would have come after the vows, after the honeymoon, after they had already purchased a home together and built an entire shared future around a marriage that had no legal standing whatsoever. Marcus offered only that he loved her, and it was, in every possible sense, the wrong thing to say in that moment, though it was the only thing he had left to offer, and it landed across that silent room like glass shattering against stone. Patricia Owens, who had quietly attended the ceremony at Danielle's request precisely for a moment like this one, stepped forward from the back of the room and calmly informed the venue's coordinator that local law enforcement needed to be contacted regarding a fraudulent marriage license filed under a false identity. Her voice remained steady and professional even as chaos rippled through the rows of stunned guests around her, some already reaching for their phones, others rising uncertainly from their seats, unsure whether to stay or leave a wedding that had just, in the span of a few devastating minutes, ceased to exist entirely. The officiant, to his credit, quietly stepped back from beneath the magnolia arch, understanding without needing to be told that there would be no ceremony to complete that afternoon. Danielle did not linger to watch the rest of it unfold. She turned, folder still held firmly in her hands, and walked back down the same aisle she had entered less than an hour earlier, past rows of guests who no longer knew where to look, past a mother-in-law who would carry the weight of this day for years to come, and out through the tall wooden doors into the crisp afternoon light. Renee followed close behind her, silent, offering nothing more than her steady presence, understanding instinctively that her sister needed space to simply breathe before either of them attempted to speak. Behind them, muffled through Magnolia Manor's tall windows, they could still hear it, Simone's anguished voice, Marcus's failed attempts at explanation, and somewhere beneath it all, the first ringing phone call to a lawyer of her own. Danielle stopped at the edge of the manicured garden, breathing in air that felt, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, entirely her own again, no longer weighed down by a secret she had been forced to carry alone. Renee finally asked if she was okay, and Danielle admitted honestly that she wasn't, not yet, but that she believed in time she eventually would be. She thought, standing there in the fading afternoon light, of Simone, a woman she had never once spoken to directly, and hoped quietly that she would find her own way through the wreckage of this day, that she would come to understand none of it had ever been her fault, that the lie belonged entirely and completely to the one man who had told it twice. In the weeks that followed, the county prosecutor's office moved quickly, confirming the bigamy charge against Marcus based directly on the fraudulent license he had filed under a false surname, along with the notarized evidence Gerald Banks had gathered over the course of his investigation. Simone, through her own attorney, filed a civil suit against Marcus seeking damages for fraud and emotional harm, covering the wedding deposits, the dress, and 14 months of a relationship she had entered in complete good faith, never once suspecting the man she loved was already legally bound to someone else. Danielle filed for divorce that same week, no longer needing to gather evidence of anything, requiring only a signature and a date to formally close a chapter of her life that had, in truth, already ended the moment she rose from her seat in that back row of chairs. Danielle and Simone never spoke to one another directly in the months that followed, though occasional word reached Danielle through mutual acquaintances that Simone had moved out of the home she had briefly shared with Marcus, returning to her own apartment and slowly, carefully rebuilding a life that no longer had any room in it for him. Danielle did much the same in her own way. She kept the house on the quiet, oak-lined street, the one they had bought together years earlier, and changed the locks within the first week, an act that was less about practical necessity and more about quietly reclaiming something that had always, in every meaningful sense, belonged to her alone. Marcus, by then, had already moved into his mother's house, too legally cornered and too publicly humiliated to argue seriously about furniture or shared belongings. 6 months after that afternoon at Magnolia Manor, Danielle sat across from Patricia Owens in her small downtown office, signing the final pages of a divorce that had, in every meaningful way, already been decided the moment she stood up in that back row of chairs. Patricia slid the completed paperwork into a folder and told her gently that the hardest part of this entire ordeal was already well behind her, that everything remaining now was simply the official record finally catching up to a truth Danielle had already lived through and, more importantly, survived. Outside the office window, the trees along the street had gone bare for winter, patient in the way trees always are, waiting quietly for a spring that would arrive regardless of anyone's plans or intentions. In the months that followed, Danielle found herself returning often, in quiet, unguarded moments, to that single afternoon at Magnolia Manor, the string quartet tuning their instruments, the magnolia blossoms wound carefully around a white arch, the officiant's old-fashioned question that most modern weddings had long since chosen to abandon entirely. Speak now, or forever hold your peace. She had spoken, standing alone in a room full of strangers who had no idea what she was about to say, and in every quiet moment since that day, through every difficult conversation, every lonely evening, every small step toward rebuilding a life she once thought she understood completely, she never once regretted the choice to break a silence that had already, by then, cost her far more than the truth itself ever could. Danielle eventually returned to work full-time, throwing herself into the steady rhythm of a job she had always found quiet comfort in, rebuilding routines that felt, slowly but surely, entirely her own again. She leaned heavily on her sisters during those early months, on long phone calls with her mother, on Sunday dinners that gradually began to feel less like survival and more like genuine comfort again. Friends who had known her and Marcus as a couple for years slowly resumed contact, some awkwardly, others with genuine warmth, and Danielle found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need to explain herself to any of them. The truth, by then, had already travelled far beyond her own telling of it, carried instead by court records, by whispered conversations among people who had once sat in those same white folding chairs at her own wedding 15 years earlier. Marcus, for his part, pleaded guilty to the bigamy charge several months later, accepting a sentence that included probation, mandatory community service, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him well beyond the courtroom doors. He never publicly explained why he had done what he did, never offered the kind of clear, complete answer that might have given either Danielle or Simone some deeper understanding of the 14 months he had spent quietly living two separate lives at once. Some questions, Danielle eventually came to accept, simply do not come with satisfying answers, no matter how long you wait for them or how much you believe you deserve one. She stopped waiting for that answer sometime around the 1-year anniversary of the day she had stood up in that back row of chairs, and instead turned her full attention toward the life still waiting patiently ahead of her. By the following autumn, almost exactly 1 year after that afternoon at Magnolia Manor, Danielle stood once again in her own backyard, the same yard where she and Marcus had once hosted quiet dinner parties years earlier, now filled instead with her sisters, her mother, and a small handful of close friends, gathered for nothing more significant than an ordinary Sunday afternoon cookout. There were no string quartets, no folded programs, no old-fashioned questions waiting to be asked or answered, just familiar voices, familiar laughter, and the quiet, hard-won understanding that some endings, however painful in the moment, ultimately clear the way for a beginning far more honest than anything that came before it. Danielle Carter had spoken the truth once in front of 200 strangers, when silence would have been so much easier. She never once regretted it. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, let us know where you are watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.